Probably the best way to expose your FHIR resources and the capabilities of your FHIR server is through OpenAPI. There are a number of open source tools available. One I could recommend to you is Swagger.io, what you see here. You could sign in for a free account, but to load many resources, you will need a paid account. So let's just see how this works. I'm going to sign into my account. And log in here. And what you see is some resources that I've translated from FHIR R4 into the OpenAPI spec. So let's just take a look at one of these resources. And what you see are really three panels. Over here on the left side is the patient resource and the different interactions like post and get, and the different paths that are supported by that interaction. You also see models, and these are really the definitions in the FHIR R4 spec in OpenAPI. To use the portal fully, you need to translate these FHIR resources into the OpenAPI spec. And as you can see here, I've done this. You have the information, the title, description. What you need to provide is a host so that you can then allow others to easily experiment and test with your OpenAPI definitions and the base path to your server and what schemes it's supported, etc. And we'll talk a little bit more about how to write these definitions. The last panel is really how people who are new to FHIR and your development team can easily test FHIR resources. So here we see a GUI version of the patient resource. So let's go down to get patient by ID, for example. We'll click on that. And at this point, people can, without any knowledge of curl or HTTP, could come in and actually experiment with this. So we'll say, let's try out this resource. And I happen to know patient number 6 is in our system, so I'm going to go ahead and execute that. And the first thing you see is, hey, if you were to try to get this resource using curl, here is the command that you would write at the command line. The same thing here if you were to request this with HTTP. We get a response code of 200, and we see that response body. So again, this is a very simple way to experiment and play with FHIR, but it all relies on effectively having an OpenAPI spec. Now to get those OpenAPI specs, you're going to need an editor. Here I'm showing you Visual Studio Code. You need to translate the capabilities of your FHIR server into OpenAPI definitions. One extension that I'll recommend that makes this a little bit easier is a extension for Visual Studio Code called OpenAPI Editor. This does a lot of things like, for example, highlighting of definitions and code completion, and it'll help you make fewer errors when translating FHIR into OpenAPI, the OpenAPI spec. It also uses a format called YAML. As you can see, it has a lot of indenting here. But what you need to do is specify every path that an interaction that your server supports, the parameters, response codes, etc. Probably the most tedious thing, and maybe the hardest, is just effectively creating all the model definitions. There's just a lot of them, and it can take a lot of time. That's why I think in the future we're going to see that the most convenient way to do this is just using commercial servers where these have already been done for you and loaded into the system, such as ours. So I think that is going to be by far easier because there's really just thousands and thousands of lines of code in doing this. There are some tools like FHIR Swagger IO that make this a little bit easier, but still there's a need for creating and annotating your definitions for your particular server. So I've gone back to the Swagger IO website, and now I'm going to show you how you could create a new definition using the YAML code I showed you in the Visual Studio Code Editor. I'm going to go ahead and click on creating a new OpenAPI definition. And I am not going to use any template. And let's just call this, this is going to be based on the observation resource. So we'll type that in. It's the first version that I've made. And it's going to be the FHIR observation. And we can create a brief description here. And immediately what you see is some stub code definitions for this FHIR resource. Now, obviously, it's showing us a mock server that we need to replace with our definition of our particular server. Well, we've already created that with Visual Studio Code. So all we really need to do is replace this entire definition with our created definition. And you see we have a valid response. And now we can exploit this by using the GUI. We could query for a different resource worth one of many parameters that are exposed. And so let's just try a parameter like the laboratory code, a LOINC code that we'll supply. And so we'll test this out, and I've selected the code 6189-5. I've looked this up in advance, obviously, but we could go ahead and test that out. We'll go down to the bottom and we'll execute the code or execute the request. And again, you see the what that request would look like in curl HTTP. And now we see we get back a bundle with two resources in it. And if we scroll down a little bit, we could see it's a laboratory observation. See the LOINC code, and we see the description for it, which is an antibody to white oak. So this is really simple. We could then, if we want to analyze it further, we could download the JSON and do any kind of other processing. But I hope this kind of gives you an idea of how you can use a development portal and OpenAPI to expose your FHIR resources.